Welcome everyone to this webinar on the 2040 target. Of course, as with always these things, we're going to have people slowly joining throughout the first 5 minutes of the call. But given that we have a lot to talk about and just an hour to cover it all in, I think it's best we get started. So as I mentioned already, this webinar is focusing on the EU's 2040 target, the proposed emissions reduction of 90% by 2040. I am your moderator for today. I'm Kieran Humphreys. I'm a research fellow at the Paris-based think tank, the Institute for Climate Economics. And it's my pleasure to have been invited by Carbon Free Europe to moderate this discussion for you today. As you'll all know, we are coming to the end of this Commission's mandate, a mandate where 2030 really was the date that loomed large in the world of EU climate policy. And the question on everyone's lips for the past few years has been, how do we get Europe fit for 55, to use the Commission's language? Yet, following the launch of the Commission's communication and impact assessment for the 2040 target, we're starting to ask ourselves about the future beyond 2030. How do we get to a 90% emissions reduction? And it's not only a question of emissions reduction, it's not just about technical questions of sectoral pathways and technological adoption. I mean, if you look at the impact assessment, the communication itself, it's clear that this discussion around the 2040 target has wide-ranging consequences and wide-ranging implications for the whole of the EU economy, whether we're thinking about competitiveness on an international scale, whether we're thinking about jobs or energy security or investment, public and private, into the European economy. And finally, before we get into our panelists, the title of this webinar is From Vision to Reality. And I think that's also where our minds need to be. It's not just a question of what Europe might be doing in 10 years' time or beyond. What we do now in this next mandate has real consequences for the future choices that we're going to face when we try to head towards the 2040 target. So this discussion is not purely abstract or theoretical. It has real implications for the campaign, for the EU elections, which is starting to ramp up, for the vote itself on June 9th and the role that climate is going to play on that. And most importantly, maybe for the priorities and the work program of the next Commission. So to take us through this maze of pathways and implications, we have a great range of speakers for you today. First, joining us from the Commission's DG NL, we have Dr. Bert Seven. Bert is team lead in the Modelling and Foresight Unit with over 16 years of experience inside the institution and was before that a researcher at the University of Leuven. Bert is going to give us a valuable view behind the curtain into the 2040 exercise. So welcome, Bert, and thank you for joining us. Then I'll move on to our panelists who are going to be helping us to dive deeper into the 2040 target. So first off, we have Dr. Florian Schneider, who is a senior research advisor for Carbon Free Europe, where he works on net zero objectives and climate strategies that are informed by high-end model data and research. His career in climate science and policy has taken him to research positions on both sides of the Atlantic as well as East Asia. Next up, we have Maja Pozvec, who is the Government Affairs Manager at Clean Air Task Force Europe, focusing on EU climate policy and advocacy. Before joining Clean Air Task Force, she was working in EU and UN agencies, as well as in public affairs consulting, looking at issues such as transportation, circular economy, and skills, which is something that is really quite important as we look to the future of the clean economy. And finally, we have Adriana Rodriguez, who is a research associate focusing on EU and Spanish climate and energy policies for climate strategy and partners. She's currently involved in research and advocacy projects around supporting the development and deployment of clean technologies, as well as working on advancing sustainable finance and promoting corporate climate action plans to reach net zero by 2050. Before we start, a quick reminder of the agenda and some housekeeping. So we're going to start off with an introductory keynote from Bert to take us through the Commission's perspective before passing to each of our panelists for a short presentation of their work. After each speaker has spoken, we'll take a few minutes to ask follow-up questions. And if you do have any questions that come up during the presentations that you'd like to ask to a specific speaker, please do use the Q&A function on this Zoom webinar. And I'll try to pick those up. I have the window open, so I'll try to pick those up and pass them on to our panelists. And then we'll move from the presentations to an open panel discussion. And again, I would encourage you to ask any and all questions in the Q&A, and I will pass them on and get the discussion going on this interesting and timely topic. Finally, the last point of housekeeping before we get into it is that this webinar is being recorded. And with that out of the way, I'd like to welcome Bert to speak and share with us the Commission's perspective on the 2040 target process. Over to you, Bert. You are muted.
Indeed. Now you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you now.
Okay, I have prepared a little slide where I will walk you through the main conclusions and the main findings of the climate target. I don't know if you see the presentation right now.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. Okay. So as you know, the Commission has presented and has adopted a communication on the 2040 climate target about 5 weeks ago, early February. And this climate target communication actually, the timing was set by the European Climate Law. It recommends a 2040 climate target, which is minus 90%. It has there's no legislative proposal, so the amendment of the climate law for 2040 will come during the next Commission. It builds upon the Fit for 55 and the Repower EU measures for 2030, and they remain unchanged. But the design for the policy framework post 2030 is also for the next Commission. And all this also fits in the international negotiations where the EU is supposed to come up with a new NDC for post 2030 by in the year 25. And the overall purpose of the communication, I think this is very important, is really to launch a debate between all the stakeholders to make everybody aware what is ahead of us in the next decade if we want to go to climate neutrality, and what that would mean for the respective actors and stakeholders in the society and the economy. So, as I said, this climate target has the recommendation has a recommendation of 90% compared to 1990 levels. There is also it goes also with certain levels of the carbon budget, and it also goes with a number of carbon removals that we would need in order to reach that. The communication was followed actually the advice came after the advice of the European Scientific Advisory Board for Climate Change, which published a report around summer last year. And as all major initiatives in the Commission, it was accompanied by a very big and extensive impact assessment, which has about 650 pages, including all the annexes. So there's a lot of detail as actually this climate target will have repercussions for virtually everyone in the society and all the sectors in the EU. So we look to 3 scenarios, and the first one is actually more or less a linear one, which would be if you have the linear trajectory between 55 and 2050, that would be at least 77.5% in 2040. Then we had the second one, which was 85 and 90. And then a third one, which was 1995. And actually the recommendation is really on the border between the second and the third target. And then the whole analysis and the impact assessment is built around these three scenarios. So what does actually that means? What does that mean, the 90% for the EU? Well, that means that the 90% would lead to a carbon budget of about 16 gigaton CO2 equivalents during 2 decades, which is pretty much consistent with what the Scientific Advisory Board for Climate Change has advised. It shows significant benefits in respect of energy independence. And also we will see later on that actually the imports of fossil fuels will reduce significantly. We have on average, or the imports of fossil fuels account for about 2-3% of the European GDP. There was an obvious spike in 22 during the energy crisis, which was induced by fossil fuels, which was induced by gas, up to 4% of the GDP. And it's clear that reducing the fossil fuel imports already saves us a lot of money over the next 2 decades. Currently, there's a global race for clean tech. We have the IRA in the US. We have obviously the EU policies that are and Fit for 55 and REPower actions that will give a big boost on clean tech deployment in the EU. And we have China, which is really stepping up its ambitions to be the factory also for clean tech. What we do see is that when you compare actually the costs and the investment needs between the three scenarios, is that they are reasonably comparable. And that actually the differences are between the ambition level and also the reliance on specific technologies in order to get to a certain level of ambition. To make sure that all this is going to happen, there's a lot of work to be done. As we have already said that we will need to look in the forthcoming years to have a consistent policy framework in order to make it happen. And with a consistent policy framework, we are thinking of elements like how do we set renewable targets or low carbon targets? How do we set energy efficiency legislation, and how do we update the emission, the ETS framework in order to be compatible and fit for the post-2030 world? But that also means that we need to do a couple of other things. First of all, the first condition, and a very important one, is that we need to implement the current and agreed 2030 framework. That's very important. That we have agreed, the Commission has just concluded a very ambitious update of its 2030 energy and climate legislation, and we need to implement it. This is going on as we speak, but we need to make sure that this continues in order to reach the -55. The second element is that we need to see how the European industry and agriculture can remain competitive in a global world where we will rely less on fossil fuels and may see fierce competition on clean tech. We need to make sure that the transition is just, that everybody is on board, and that everybody, the whole society is, and all countries and all people are actually moving into the right direction, and that they feel that this does not harm them particularly. It's important to have a level playing field between the international partners, and we do see that overall there's a tendency to have more climate policies across the globe, but there's still a wide gap between some of the ambitions in the respective countries. And as already said, actually the whole communication, the setup is to really force to really force all stakeholders in the society to think what it means to move towards climate neutrality the post 2030 period. I think I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time, but let's look to a very important part of it, and that is the energy system. What do we find? The energy system is despite the is probably the sector that has the highest level of emissions compared to the other sectors, but that also means that it has the highest potential to reduce the emissions. And what we find in the analysis that the electrification is absolutely the key driver to come to decarbonization. The power sector is probably the first sector in the economy that will be fully decarbonized, and this will happen around 2040. Renewables will be very, very important. They will be really the backbone of the energy system, but we also find that we will need all solutions. Not every emission you can reduce with renewables, or in your electricity system, you may need to have some features in order to cope with some weather conditions or some peak demand and so on. So we will need all type of energy solutions, including on top of renewables, energy efficiency, nuclear storage, CCS, CCUS, and other type of carbon removals. We find in our analysis that the fossil fuels imports or fossil fuels use will reduce by about 80% compared to 2020. So that's a very, very significant drop in the use of fossil fuels. And actually, towards 2050, the share of the fossil fuels that are being used for non-energy purposes will increase. We will scale up hydrogen and all its derivatives as of 2030 exponentially, and the role of energy consumption reduction and energy efficiency remains very, very important. Electrification, as already said, is really the key of the decarbonization, and the consumption of electricity will double between 2040 and 2020. A last element, and which is also very important in this debate of in the communication, is actually the role of the industry. We will need to make sure that we have that we are not reliant on other suppliers, that we have some strategic autonomy, but we will also need to make sure that our EU industry will remain competitive, so that we have stable and affordable clean energy throughout. Circular economy will be important, including for critical raw materials. And in general, also, there is a need and scope for carbon removals, whether they are bio-based or industrial. All this will require significant investments. And we estimate that on average, across the scenarios for between 2030 and 2050, we will need 660 billion euro investments per year in order to make the transition happen. Going for 90 instead of slightly lower ambition levels means that we kind of front load those investments. Overall, the average remains the same, but that means that in the next decade, we will see 710 billion instead of 660. When we introduce behavioral changes, which are voluntary, then we see that we can actually reduce significantly the amount of investments by almost 50 billion euros. The whole purpose actually of this communication is to, well, not only to open the debate, but also to give regulatory certainty for the investors, because the energy system and a large part of the economy is actually characterized by investments that have a pretty long lead time, but also have a pretty long lifetime. So investment decisions being made today will still exist in 2040. And a third point that actually we highlight in the impact assessment is that when we look to the investments, we need to address the bottlenecks. And when you look to the NECPs, to the implementation of the current 2030 ambition levels, we see that the individual modular parts of the transition are doing reasonably well. We have record levels of PV installed, including on rooftop. We have lots of heat pumps installed. Electric cars are really becoming a pretty standard feature in the European traffic. But what is missing is actually the integration of the system, to make that all these individual technologies are interconnected in order to provide the flexibility and in order to deal with the intermittency of renewables. So we need to have a specific focus to connecting elements like grids, flexible demand, and storage. So this is the last slide, and I think the most important elements are that this is this 2040 communication is really to open the debate, to prepare the minds of everyone of what is ahead of us, that enabling conditions and will be necessary, because it's not going to be easy. It's feasible, but it's definitely not an easy ride, and that the if done in a cost-effective way, that this is also a very good way to make the EU less dependent on critical dependencies, whether on fossil fuels or other production capacity, and make it a more strategic autonomous. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bert, for what was a really excellent dive into the communication, into the modeling that you've done. I think if for those of us who haven't tackled the 600+ page impact assessment, I think this gives us a lot of what we needed to know, so that's really helpful. We do have a bit of time for a few questions. And so first off, I think just for all of our understanding of kind of the future process around this, could you outline what you expect from what you expect to follow from this communication in the process towards the legislative proposal? What are kind of the milestones that you're expecting and working around, and what's the rough timeline in terms of that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a bit of an unusual process. We are at the end of the commission. And as already said, we came up with this because of the European climate law, because of the timings as set in the European climate law. It's a communication, so it's a recommendation. There's absolutely no, not yet a legally binding proposal attached to it. And this is expected to come in the next commission. As you know, and definitely as the European participants are aware of, the commission will come is it in its last months. We will get a new commission in the second half of this year. We have elections throughout the European Union for a new European Parliament in June. So we will have a new commission at some point in the second half of this year, and also this commission will then come up likely, although we don't know what the real plans are of the next commission, and it very depends also on the outcome of the elections. But it is expected that the next commission will come up with a proposal to amend the climate law for 2040, setting an overreaching greenhouse level reduction ambition for 2040. So that's the first step. This will be an input for the NDCs and the UNFCCC process in 2025. But having a target is one thing, implementing it is another thing. So, and this is then expected to happen, or on the timing, we have to see what the real proposals will be of the Commission, but a possible date could be in 26, 27, to come up with a new energy and climate framework in order to make sure to be in time for the implementation after 2030 of this minus 90 or of the implementation of the new climate target for 2040.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Bert. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we're going to have to move on to the next phase in our discussion, but I don't know if you have time to stay around for future discussions. But if not, thank you so much for your input, and it was really great to get this insight.
Thanks a lot.
With that, we'll move on to our panelists. So first up, we have Florian, who's going to be presenting to us Carbon Free Europe's work around the 2040 target. Over to you, Florian.
There we go. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kieran. And hey, everyone. Carbon for Europe, we have done a little bit of modeling work over the last 2-3 years, especially around the annual decarbonization perspective. And it happened to be that our modeling showed the case of minus 90% GHG emissions by 2040. And so we can dive a little bit deeper into the context. Since I didn't really know what the details of Mr. Savin's contribution would be, I just want to remind us all of like the EU target is 90 to 95%, like the third target, and there is the especially the fact of EU competitiveness and the clean tech market is a focus of the European Union to make sure that we are not dependent on outside sources as much as we are currently with fossil fuels. The other consideration was also for our modeling that we have, that Fit for 55 is achieved. So anything that I'm going to say now kind of is about 2030 to 2040, rather than talking about the time before. So in the end, how can the European Union achieve minus 90% GHG emissions? And our modeling, which assumes 2050 net zero and then has a 90% target at 2040, basically says that we have economy-wide energy efficiency improvements that are necessary, that mean that we have to reduce the current, right now, final energy consumption by 30%. And we can do this on all parts of the energy system, from production, consumption, and transportation or transmission of electricity. Second, we have a need for electrification and use of hydrogen or even other alternative low carbon fuels. So meaning we need to replace fossil fuels first in building and transportation sector that can give us the biggest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the near term. Additionally, one of the bigger factors when we think about electrification is that we will have a need for much more electricity generation due to that electricity demand. And that need, according to our modeling, moves from 4,000 terawatt hours in 2030 across the European Union to 7,000 terawatt hours by 2040. That requires not only that we produce more, but we also need to be able to transmit and distribute that, and means the grid needs to be expanded. Second page on this is we need to plan now for the hard-to-abate sectors, meaning research and development for emerging technologies around carbon capture, use, storage, hydrogen, electricity storage, or how industry can be transitioned and what role nuclear power could play. We need to embrace innovation and clean technology investment. And I'm now going a little bit into the growth portion, meaning what electric capacity build-out would be required starting 2030. We just saw the investment cost from Mr. Savin of like 660 billion euros per year. That would include almost 60 gigawatts of solar across the European Union, 20 gigawatts of onshore per year, offshore 23 gigawatts, and even 5 gigawatts of nuclear. We know that many nations in the European Union have no nuclear as by law. So these nuclear sources would be in different countries across the European Union. I want to highlight that there's difficulties that we have to deal with respect to renewable resource limitations, where solar power is really efficient in the south of the European Union, onshore wind in the north, northwest, and west, and offshore wind, obviously, in the Baltic, North Sea, and close to Ireland, where it is efficient and affordable. So when we look at that, we have this gap on the eastern side of the European Union, where other alternative energy sources need to be applied, or transmission need to be supported. That means we talk about, we just saw 660 billion euros as total cost, I assume. For pure clean energy infrastructure, we estimate, or our model estimated 250 billion euros. That's 1.7% of the European GDP of 2022. which is less than the current pay for fossil fuel imports of 4.1% GDP. 2/3 of that go to renewables, and the other third would go to clean technologies, clean infrastructure such as nuclear power, CCUS, hydrogen, and most importantly, to connect everything for flexibility, transmission, and storage. So how to achieve it? We need to have transition drivers around competitiveness. We need to make sure that everyone is on board via de-risking energy transition. We have to have public and private investment required. And lastly, in my opinion, we really need to gain the social acceptance and support. Otherwise, we won't be able to implement renewable energy across the European nations to the scale that we need them. And additionally, we also need to make sure that cross-country support for transmission and transportation of low-carbon fuels is encouraged to ensure European energy security and sovereignty. That's it for me. I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florian. And yeah, I would again encourage any of our viewers throughout all these presentations to please do send their questions in the Q&A. But from my end, I wanted to just go in a bit more about that very interesting map that you showed about the electric capacity build out, and to understand a bit more about this kind of, as you mentioned, this gap in sort of Central and Eastern Europe. And my question is, what does that mean? Are they not in a position to build out their own domestic renewables? What are the implications of that? And then how can we make sure that all Europeans have access to this cheap electricity in the future?
Yeah, I decided to bring up that map again. Thank you, Kieran, for the question. I think the key point here is that the areas highlighted are where these renewable energies are really efficient, meaning we have relatively low cost and high output. Like the efficiency factor would be high, the capacity factor relatively high for renewable energy. The other piece that I want to recognize is, yes, on the Eastern European side, or where there is no onshore as efficient or no solar as efficient, it still works. We only have to look at, for example, one of the solar leaders in Europe, Germany, as of now. They have a lot of solar. It's just not as efficient, and it is relatively more expensive to build it. And so we want to assume here kind of the low cost approach. How can we achieve a net zero transition that is just by reducing the cost for everyone as much as possible? Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. And I mean, that then makes me think that of the real importance of having this real European approach to our transition, to have this kind of most efficient placing of different renewable sources. We'll obviously be picking up on more of these themes in the panel, but for now, I'd like to pass over to Maya to present her perspective. Maya, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kieran. And thank you also to Carbon for Europe for inviting us here today. As mentioned, my name is Maya Pozvek. I am part of the EU representation for Clean Air Task Force. We are an international climate nonprofit that really tries, sort of through advocacy, expand the options that different countries and sectors have available in their decarbonization journeys, given that they're likely to differ a bit, and also as a way of managing risk. And so in terms of the 2040 communication, we were pleased to see a bit of an expansion in terms of the solution set that the Commission endorses. There were specific references, for instance, to geothermal energy that had been previously a bit neglected, references to carbon capture and storage, to nuclear energy, and these were also accompanied by some concrete initiatives like the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy and the Industrial Alliance on Small Modular Reactors, which the Commission both launched on the same day. And so we think these are very positive developments, but of course, there's always room for improvement. For instance, we think that the potential contribution of nuclear energy is still understated. So the Commission uses numbers from about a year ago, which means they assume first a decline and then a stagnation in nuclear energy capacity. And there have been developments in the last year that would suggest otherwise, right? So there's been disagreement at the top to try to triple nuclear energy capacity, which several European countries have signed up to. Also, several individual EU member states have said they would either build or expand their nuclear energy capacity, like Poland, Czechia, Romania, and others are considering doing so, including my home country of Slovenia. So lots going on there. Then I mentioned geothermal energy, which has been referenced, but not much more than that. You may know that the European Parliament recently called for an EU strategy in this area, and we think this would be really helpful to sort of align and intensify efforts to harness this clean, renewable, firm energy source. Particularly when it comes to some of the more next generation pathways like superhot rock that could be sited everywhere in Europe and could so benefit all EU member states. On carbon capture and storage, we've seen that several of the scenarios that the Commission modeled in their impact assessment do imply wide-scale deployment of carbon capture and storage. In fact, the higher the target, the more CCS we'll need in 2040, right? And so here we now do have a strategy, as I mentioned, but it still has to be implemented, particularly when it comes to some of the key initiatives in that strategy, like for instance, the Atlas of Potential Storage Sites, a regulatory framework for CO2 transportation, and also, for instance, a matchmaking platform that would connect the stakeholders in the field. Then we also think we need to start looking more seriously at fusion. The Commission did not mention this potentially revolutionary, clean energy source. And while it may appear a bit further away, it's important that we, take steps today so that we can demonstrate it and commercialize it as soon as possible. We have, of course, the ITER project that the EU is investing a lot into. But we need also other pathways that are more sort of commercial, so that ultimately we can commercialize fusion. And so there's still a lot of things that have to be done in the follow-up to the communication. Of course, the EU member states have a key role to play here. The Commission does say in the communication, and as we've heard before, achieving the recommended 2040 target depends on the 2030 framework being fully implemented. And that's not a given, right? We know that the European Court of Auditors found little indication that EU targets will translate into sufficient action. And also the European Commission in their assessment of the updated national energy and climate plans said that these plans, as they currently are in their draft format, are not sufficient to reach that 2030 target. And so, now it's really the key time. We have a couple of months left before the final deadline for NECPs to really sharpen those plans and kind of make the decisions today that put us on track, not only for 2030, but also for deeper reductions past the date. But then, just implementing the existing framework is also not sufficient for the Paris Agreement. Fit for 55 in global terms, it is hugely important and could be even said ambitious, but it's not the end of EU climate policy, right? Another important reference to the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, they said that more efforts are needed across all sectors for us to reach the climate targets. The elephant in the room is agriculture, so methane emissions there have to be addressed in a constructive way that does respond to farmers' concerns, but that also incentivizes best practices that are available, like manure management, feed additive use, low emission breeding, for instance. Another key sector is the transportation, of course, where emissions are still growing. So we need more attention there still, particularly for hard to decarbonize segments like shipping, aviation, providing further incentives for truly sustainable fuels, and also making sure that the infrastructure gets built. And so, given how challenging several of these sectors are to decarbonize, it's very likely that we'll need to complement emissions reductions with carbon removals. The Commission does say so as well. And so we think that it would be helpful to kind of, as part of this process, set 3 separate targets for 2030. So one for emissions reduction, one for land-based sequestration, and then a third one for industrial removals with permanent storage. The Commission did not decide to go for this approach in the communication, despite the majority of stakeholders in the public consultation advocating for separate targets. So we hope this is still something that can be sort of addressed in the legislative proposal. And so, yeah, just to conclude, I think, you know, the 2040 targets really cannot be taken in isolation. So about connecting the dots throughout the next decades to 2050 and beyond. But it hopefully gives us a good opportunity to you know, really think, reflect on the EU climate policy in general, and yeah, make sure that we keep up the pace in the next term. The job is not yet done, and that these targets do not just end up being on paper, but that they are in fact achieved. I'll stop here in the interest of time, but thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you, Maya. You've raised so much there that is interesting, particularly around a lot of technologies that may be in the kind of mainstream Brussels climate debate we don't talk about so much, things like nuclear and different kinds of storage, sustainable fuels, but also carbon removals. And I'd like to understand a bit more about this particular sector. Why do you feel that there is a need to go kind of more granular? Because as we saw from Bert's presentation, the Commission has kind of seen that there is a need for carbon removals through to 2040 and kind of lumps it in all as land-based and industrial carbon removals as kind of one category. Do you think that's a step in the right direction, or why do we need to get more granular with these targets? It would be great to hear your perspective and reasoning there.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. I think, yeah, I think the Commission says 2 things, right? They say carbon removals will be needed in 2040 and quite a significant amount, right? I think they use 400 megatons as a kind of combined number for all types of removals, which gives us a bit of a sense of scale, but we still think, and like I said, we are not alone in that. We think it will be useful to make these explicit targets, just, you know, simply so we can make sure that we track our progress on these 3 very different processes that require different types of support, right? So, you know, first of all, it's not the same emitting and then removing carbon versus not emitting in the first place. So reductions do need to stay the priority, and you know, we cannot keep on emitting thinking we'll be able to use removals to reach the target down the line, which is the risk with having an undifferentiated like net target. But at the same time, if we say we'll need removals, then we still need to make sure that we reach adequate scale. We currently have, you know, 0 direct air capture capacity in the EU. The land sink is decreasing. So giving this very strong signal and you know, hopefully in regulation further down the line, this would be a signal to stakeholders in the field on the scale that we need. And just, you know, make sure, yeah, that we can track our progress individually and hold ourselves accountable as well.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Maya. And I'd like to now pass over to Adriana. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kieran. Let me share my screen. Can you see the presentation?
Yes,
Yeah.
but you need to make it full screen. Yeah, there you go.
Great. So I just wanted to quickly delve into some of the positive messages that Bert has already highlighted, and how these 2040 targets can be beneficial for industry, for households, and also some recommendations that we have developed on how to make these benefits a reality, right? Which is the purpose of this webinar. So I'll just quickly go through these first few slides, whereby the Commission impact assessment shows that well, the 2040 target of a 90% emissions reduction is great to avoid the high cost of inaction that otherwise will cost from 10 to 12% of global GDP by the end of the century on a conservative estimate. And also that achieving these targets will only have a negligible and transitory impact on EU GDP. So these are more the macro level kind of benefits, but I also wanted to delve into specific opportunities that the 2040 target could bring to industry on the one hand by accelerating investment and deployment of clean tech, and therefore taking advantage of the clean tech race that Bert has already mentioned, and advancing the competitiveness of the EU industry. Yeah, the Commission has already presented this today, but the 2040 90% reduction target will require higher annual investments in the first decade, but less there afterwards. And by front loading these investments, we can really take advantage in the clean tech race and improve our position in this race. And then another opportunity is the increased resilience that Bert has also mentioned, and the gains from reduced import dependency and the energy security we would achieve, the savings of 2.8 trillion until 2050, and the halving of the impact of energy crisis like the one after the Ukraine invasion that households had to live through, and the industry with higher energy prices. So I wanted to pay a little of attention to these two opportunities here and delve a bit deeper into how we can unlock them with some recommendations. So as I said, the 90% target requires an accelerated investment and deployment of clean technologies. And the good thing is that as the Commission assessment shows, this is technologically feasible because the main bulk of clean tech that we need to achieve the 2040 target is ready to be deployed. It's mature, or even though we still need some additional push on carbon capture and e-fuels. And of course, for this clean tech to be deployed, we need investment. And only for 5 strategic clean technologies, the Commission estimates that we need 23 billion euros between 2030 and 2040. These technologies will be batteries, wind, electrolyzers, solar PV, and heat pumps. But we need much more for other sectors and other clean technologies. And this is what is needed to provide certainty, not just regulation, but also an investment plan that will show that this regulation will be actually implemented. So together with more than 30 signatories, we recently sent a letter to the EU institutions asking for a predictable and long-term clean tech investment plan that accompanies this 2040 target to provide the necessary budget for clean tech instead of what has been unfortunately recently happening with budget cuts to Horizon Europe, and by shifting new opportunities from the Strategic Technologies European platform away from clean tech, we need to do quite the opposite and provide an adequate, concise response like what the US is doing with the IRA and what China is doing. So we have developed 7 recommendations here that I'm not going to go into depth right now, but we can discuss in the panel. And these recommendations are a way to build a clean tech investment plan period for 2040. In summary, what we want is that, of course, more money is put in the envelope for clean tech, and this money can come from current subsidies to pollution, and by a better allocation of current resources, and this is quite key. So we need to also make a better use of what existing instruments right now that are designed for clean tech are doing by providing capacity building, by providing more staff, less administrative costs to innovators, and also by using innovative instruments like guarantees. And then the last part I wanted to focus on, of one of the other opportunities that I mentioned, which is the increased resilience and energy security for households, is the building sector. So the Commission has identified buildings as key to achieve the 2040 targets because until now, emissions reduction has been sluggish. And actually higher energy efficiency in the building sector will limit the cost for households in order to achieve a just transition. The residential sector actually will require most amounts of investment from the demand side, and we have estimated a climate strategy that 6 trillion euros will be needed to renovate all EU homes by 2050. But of course, not all of these will come from public. Actually, 75% of funding will need to come from private sources. And here we would recommend an EU renovation loan to facilitate energy efficiency finance to homeowners. We have a report that I can put in their chat right now on what this EU renovation loan is, but basically it will target homes with poor economics that are not eligible for further loans, and therefore this is a quite difficult segment of the population to address, and where we think that a mix of public funding but also private funding backed by an EU guarantee could really help and unlock the energy security and resilience again. So I'm going to stop here, Kieran, in case you have another question.
Sure. Thank you so much, Adriana, for taking us through that more investment side. But I'd like to pick up on the last thing that you raised around building and renovation. I'll admit that it's not an area which I've followed particularly closely. So, but I'm aware that there is kind of this debate going on in Brussels at the moment, and we've had in the past years around the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So clearly, renovating Europe's building stock is a crucial part of getting us to net zero. But where are we? Are we on track with that progress? Are efforts like the EPBD or this renovation loan, proposed renovation loan that you're talking about, is that enough to kind of get us on track, or is there much more left to do?
So our opinion is that the EPBD really marks a before and after in building emissions regulations. Until now, unfortunately, implementation of the renovation wave has been very bad. Let's say no one has reached the 3% target that the Commission had put forward with the renovation wave strategy. And therefore, the EPBD has now introduced some key levers to push these renovation efforts, especially minimum energy performance standards, which will require member states to put targets for the residential and non-residential sector to push energy efficiency through renovations. But of course, again, implementation will become an issue if we don't address market barriers like the issue of access to finance, which is what we're looking into. Here, Article 15 of the EPBD asks member states to put forward instruments to address market barriers, and one of them, which we have worked on, is called the Mortgage Portfolio Standards, which is defined in the preamble of the EPBD. And I can also put the link in the chat to this report, but basically what Mortgage Portfolio Standards will do is unlock bank lending by requiring banks to set targets to increase the medium energy performance of their mortgages. And like this, of course, unlock finance for homeowners and incentivize this renovation wave. So this MPS, we call it Mortgage Portfolio Standards, will be further developed by the Commission in a delegated act, and we're going to be following this process. It's a voluntary framework, but there are already banks implementing these instruments, and the EU renovation loan would add to this by making some kind of homeowners easier access to loans, because MPS is not the only thing needed. We also need that some segments of the population are more attractive for banks to lend money to. So yeah, this is I can put all these links in the chat so people can get more information.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Adriana. And it would be great if you could share those links. And of course, we'll also be sending follow-up materials to all attendees with slides and everything like that. So in the time that we have left, it would be great if we could welcome back our other two panelists for a collective discussion on some of these issues. We have already some questions that have been asked and responded to in the Q&A, but please do keep them coming in if you have anything that you'd like to hear from our panelists. And we have had some pre-submitted questions as well, but I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator to kick us off. And maybe one element that we've kind of come up on again, time and again, is that this is all going to cost quite a lot of money. The Commission communication has pointed to the investment needs explicitly, as we saw in Bert's presentation. Now, none of us have kind of a crystal ball for what the financial solutions could be in the 2030 decade and going past into the 2040 decade. But what should Europe be doing? What should Europe be prioritizing now? And maybe this is first a question actually back to Adriana, who brought some of these ideas up in her presentation. What should we be doing as far as investment into these clean technologies, investment into climate action, into building renovation, etc., to get us now on track for 2040?
Yeah,
Maybe
so
Adriana, you can kick off.
Yeah, of course. So as I've mentioned, on the one hand, we have to, of course, put more money in the envelope for clean tech by increasing the budget of existing instruments like the Innovation Fund, and also giving member states with have given them more investment capacity in the future to be able to help their clean tech industry. But also we need to do a better and smarter use of current resources. And here what we found is that the existing instruments that are catering for clean tech don't have enough money, but also enough staff to deliver at speed and scale. We have been looking, for instance, at the US Department of Energy Loan Program Office that is handling IRA, and they have like by multiple factors much more staff than for instance the EIB and other instruments have. So another institutions, sorry. And also these would help these core instruments to have a more proactive approach, identifying projects and engaging with companies so they know what is already out there, because many innovators don't know the existing opportunities for funding. And finally, one innovative instrument I've quickly mentioned are public guarantees. So we really recommend that the EIB expands the scheme of counter guarantees they have for wind for other clean tech sectors, which is a very efficient way of using public resources. But I don't want to take more time from the rest of speakers, so I'll stop here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adriana. Anyone else want to come in on the question of investment more broadly as well, and what we should do? Otherwise, we can move to the other questions that have come in.
Well, I would just encourage, like, investment-wise, we just need to acknowledge that the pure renewable approach is likely going to be extremely expensive, and not just in that sense, and that we need to look into diverse technology strategies and invest thus in innovative and emerging technologies, such as carbon dioxide removal technologies, such as advanced nuclear, small modular reactors, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to emphasize that.
Yeah, maybe just to add as well, I mean, a lot has already been said, but also, you know, I think when it comes to the EU level, there's been a bit of a bias towards some of the earlier technology readiness levels, right? Like obviously, you know, Horizon is very important for a lot of projects. Innovation Fund, you know, oversubscribed, everyone's favorite fund, but kind of we need to make sure we connect the dots, right, and kind of make sure that the projects can move down the technology development line all the way to deployment and kind of market saturation. So to kind of, you know, make sure that we support projects at any stage they might be when it comes to clean technologies.
Brilliant, thank you all. Next, we have a question from Beata from the Ministry of Climate and Environment of Poland. And this may be to start with you, Maya, who's been looking at specific technologies, but open to all of you. What is the role of nuclear power in meeting these climate targets?
Yeah, I mean, I can take the question, but I don't think, you know, it's not up to me to answer. I think it's really up to the member states themselves, and some of the sort of developments that I flagged earlier were really led by the member states that, you know, either already rely on nuclear energy in their electricity generation, or have kind of recognized it as a, you know, given that it is a zero carbon clean energy option, that they might want to rely on it more in the future as they try to decarbonize, particularly when it comes to the more innovative versions like small modular reactors, right? So I think, yeah, it's really up to the member states, right? But then at the EU level, I think it's just up to the policymakers to make sure that member states can pursue these options should they wish to, in a way that is respective of the single market.
Brilliant, thanks. I don't know if any of you want to come in on that topic. Otherwise, Florian, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge what Maya said by also adding the component of nuclear is extremely difficult to build at the moment because our supply chain, our knowledge in Europe is just not really there. So we really need to rely on international cooperation, rely on legislative processes that encourage or provide incentives to build that supply chain in Europe, to incorporate collaboration with the UK, with the United States, with other partners across the world, to make nuclear faster in build out, but also more affordable.
Brilliant. And kind of now zooming out from the technology level, and I'm aware we're running out of time, so I think we'll just have a time for a couple more questions, which will deal with the politics of all this, knowing the year that we're in. I'm interested, and this may be to you first, Florian. You mentioned the importance of social acceptability in getting to the 2040 target, bringing the European people along with us, and this is even more kind of poignant. Not of course, we've had the previous trauma of the Gilets Jaunes protest, but also more recently the farmers' protests in Brussels and across Europe, you can sense the climate backlash kind of starting to creep in. So how do we ensure that our 2040 pathway, with our kind of efficient spread of energies across an entire continent, etc., how do we ensure that we bring the people along with us? Maybe Florian first.
Boy, Kieran, that is a tough question. First of all, I cannot speak for all of you on that. Like, that's just impossible, you know? But I think what's really important is kind of to have collaborative approaches with local communities and ask them what they would need from us in terms of energy and electricity, so that we can provide the incentives and leverages that allow them to build local wind power, for example. And there's a lot of counter at the moment in many different European countries against onshore wind, because of it's not really beautiful look, or it's supposedly noise pollution and so on and so forth. It's a difficult concept, and not to say people don't know. I think that's the wrong reason. The reason is people may not know what they would miss out on when having it, right? We spoke about the 4% GDP to import fossil fuels. If we switch that over to 2% GDP for renewables and clean technologies, there's 2% more that can be used for social efforts in that sense, you know, and that could bring people along potentially.
Adriana?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring in the perspective from what happened throughout the EPBD negotiation process, where there was a lot of misinformation in some member states about how the implementation of the EPBD will throw some people out of their houses. And, you know, we need to counteract this misinformation to show that, for instance, in building renovation, it can bring quite a lot of benefits to households with reduced energy bills and more comfort in their own homes. That's on the one hand. So the narrative, working on the narrative and delivering the messages is key, and fighting the ones that are not real, right? And then on the other hand, a better use of public money is key during the transition, because it's not resourceless, right? The public purse. So here, subsidies, what I've seen is that in some countries, they're not reaching the poorest households in building renovation subsidies. And what we need to do is that to make sure subsidies are mainly used for those households that actually need them, and use private finance, unlock private finance and equity for those households that can actually pay for the renovation, and incentivizing banks and other kind of financial institutions to support these investment efforts that we require.
Brilliant. Unless Maya wants to come in on this topic, maybe I'll move to the last question, as I know we're now over time. And I thought it would be important to kind of tie us, and maybe we can start with you, Maya, but give each of you a chance to respond, tie us to this election that's coming up. June the 9th, the whole of Europe is going to vote on the European Parliament. This brings us into a new Commission mandate, new priorities, and often different priorities. And that's really the feeling that we're starting to get. We're not in 2019 anymore. We're talking questions of competitiveness, energy security, defense, immigration. And at the same time, we're kind of hearing from member states, from inside the Parliament, a call for enough of the regulation, a regulatory pause. So maybe this isn't the best kind of environment to discuss a new wave of climate policy. So if you were the campaign manager, or if you were the eminence grise behind these campaigns, how do we tie this really important 2040 discussion, this thinking about the next wave of EU climate policy after the 2030 framework? How do we tie it to make it relevant for voters and for politicians and for policymakers in this current political context?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question, and I think something we all worry about, really, right? I think, you know, something that has already happened, kind of in response to the geopolitical and kind of economic shocks we've had recently in terms of the energy provision and price. And I think it's very obvious in the 2040 communication is that sort of climate policy does not exist in isolation, right? It's very much framed more increasingly as the EU's growth strategy, as the Commission would put it, right? So, and I think, that's a positive thing, right? I mean, if we're trying to sort of really transform the way we kind of power our economies and how our industries work, we do have to consider kind of the key elements of what makes an economy competitive, right? Including the price of energy and kind of making sure that it's available 24/7. So I think, the right path forward would certainly not be stopping climate policy making. I hope we've shown today that we cannot afford to, but to really make sure that this is kind of grounded in reality, that it's pragmatic, offers options, and kind of, manages risk. And so I think, the European Commission has sort of recognized this. They've said a lot of that in the communication. I think that's the right way to go, but hopefully it resonates with, a majority of voters and the parties they vote for, and that this can remain kind of the basis for decision making in the next term.
Brilliant. Adriana, Florian, come in on this.
Yeah, I will agree with what Maja has said. And of course, we need more policy to implement the new targets and regulatory fixes to the current policy framework. And of course, we need this climate clean tech investment plan, because it's not just the regulation that we need, but it's also money to implement it.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna say the European Commission provides frameworks in that sense, right? It's in the end, it's up to the member states to really make the changes happen. And right now that's on NECP for like 2030 targets, what's gonna come around on 2040 targets. We need to figure out how each member state feels ownership of this issue at large, and how they can mobilize their populations to join us on this climate policy approach, whether that is via a social perspective or an economic perspective, or an environmental perspective. In that sense, is up to each individual nation in the end. And I think that's what needs to be acknowledged. But best would obviously be to include the three pillars at the same time, right? But yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. And with that, that brings us beyond the end of our session. So thanks for you all for sticking with us and for engaging with this interesting discussion. We've covered the whole gamut of topics that can connect to the 2040 discussion, from the technical details or geographical deployment of energy through to social and political concerns going into the next European mandate. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's true. We're heading into a new phase of EU climate policy, and the 2040 target is at the core of that. But of course, as we're all talking about, the question in Brussels from many politicians and also in capitals is, why should I care? Why is this a priority now? And I think with this discussion, we have all now a bit more argumentation, a bit more understanding of why it matters, and to go into this election campaign and discussions around the future mandate better informed and better able to fight for a more ambitious European climate policy. So thanks very much to our speakers, who are going to remain open for questions via email. Thanks to Carbon Free Europe for organizing this event, and thanks to you all for joining us. I wish you a good rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Sharon.
Bye-bye.